How the ballpoint pen killed Cursive. In 2015, Bic launched a campaign to save handwriting named Fight for Your Right, spelled W-R-I-T. It included a pledge to encourage the act of handwriting in the pledge taker's home and community, and emphasizes putting more of the company's ballpoints into classrooms. As a teacher, I couldn't help but wonder how anyone could think there is a shortage. I find ballpoint pens all over the place, on classroom floors, behind desks, dozens of castaways in cups, and on every teacher's desk. They're so ubiquitous that the word ballpoint is rarely used. They're just pens. But despite its popularity, the ballpoint pen is relatively new in the history of handwriting, and its influence on popular handwriting is more complicated than the Bic complaint would imply. The creation story of the ballpoint pen tends to highlight a few key individuals, most notably the Hungarian journalist Laszlo Brio, who is credited with inventing it. But, as with most stories of individual genius, this take obscures a much longer history of iterative engineering and marketing success. In fact, Brio wasn't the first to develop the idea. The original ballpoint pen was patented in 1888 by an American leather tanner named John Loud, but his idea never went any further. Over the next few decades, dozens of other patents were issued for pens that used a ballpoint tip of some kind, but none of them would make it to market. These early pens failed not in their mechanical design, but in their choice of ink. The ink used a fountain pen. The ballpoint's predecessor, is thinner to facilitate better flow through the nib. But put that thinner ink inside a ballpoint pen, you end up with a leaky mess. The ink is where Laszlo Brio, working with his chemist brother Georgie, made critical changes. They experimented with a thicker, quick-drying inks, starting with the ink used in newsprint presses. Eventually, they refined both the ink and the ball-tip design to create a pen that didn't leak badly. This was an era in which a pen could be a huge hit, but because it only leaked ink sometimes. The Brios lived in a troubled time, however. The Hungarian author Georgi Moldova writes in his book Ballpoint about Laszlo's flight from Europe to Argentina to avoid Nazi persecution. While his business dealings in Europe were in disarray, he patented the design in Argentina in 1943 and began production. His big break came later that year when the British Air Force, in search of a pen that would work at high altitudes, purchased 30,000 of them. Soon, patents were filed and sold to various companies in Europe and North America, and the ballpoint pen began to spread across the globe. Businessmen made significant fortunes by purchasing the rights to manufacture the ballpoint pen in their country, but one was especially noteworthy: Marcel Bic, spelled B-I-C-H, the man who bought the patent rights in France. Bic didn't just profit off the ballpoint, he won the race to make it cheap. When it first hit the market in 1946, a ballpoint pen sold for around $10, roughly the equivalent of $100 today. Competition brought that price steadily down, but Bic's design drove it into the ground. When the Bic Crystal hit American markets in 1959, the price was down to 19 cents a pen. Today, the Crystal sells for about the same amount despite inflation. The ballpoint's universal success has changed how most people experience ink. It's thicker ink that's less likely to leak than that of its predecessors. For most purposes, this is a win. No more ink-stained shirts, no more need for the stereotypically geeky pocket protectors. However, thicker ink also changes the physical experience of writing, not necessarily for the better. I wouldn't have noticed the difference if it wasn't for my affection for unusual pens, which brought me to my first good fountain pen. A lifetime of writing with a ballpoint and minor variations on the concept, gel pens, rollerballs, etc., left me unprepared for how completely different a fountain pen would feel. Its thin ink immediately gives a mark on the paper with even the slightest pressure-free touch to the surface. My writing suddenly grew extra lines, appearing between what used to be separate pen strokes. My hand, trained by the ballpoint, expected that lessening the pressure from the pen was enough to stop writing. I found I had to lift it clear off the paper entirely. Once I started to adjust this change, however, it felt like a godsend. A less firm press on the page meant less strain on my hand. My fountain pen is a modern one, and probably not a great representation of typical pens of the 1940s, but it still has some of the troubles that plagued fountain pens and quills of old. I have to be careful where I rest my hand on the paper or risk smudging this last still wet line into an ineligible blur. And since thin ink flows more quickly, I have to refill my pen frequently. The Ballpoint solved these problems, giving writers a long-lasting pen and a smudge-free paper for the low cost of some extra hand pressure. As a teacher whose kids are usually working with numbers and computers, handwriting isn't an immediate concern for me, as it is to many of my colleagues. However, every so often I have come across another story about the decline of handwriting. Inevitably, these articles focus on how writing has been supplanted by new or digital forms of communication, typing, texting, Facebook, Snapchat, blah-de-blah. They discuss the loss of class time for handwriting practice that is instead devoted to typing lessons. Last year, a New York Times article, one that's been highlighted by the Bix Fight for Your Right campaign, brought up an fMRI study suggesting that writing by hand could be better for kids' language learning than using a computer. I can't recall the last time I saw my students passing actual paper notes in class, but I clearly remember students checking their phones recently and often. In his History of Handwriting, The Missing Ink, the author Philip Hensher recalls the moment he realized that he had no idea what his good friend's handwriting looked like. It never struck to me as strange before. We could have gone on like this forever, hardly noticing we had no need of handwriting anymore. No need of handwriting? Surely there must be a reason I keep finding pens everywhere. Of course, the meaning of handwriting can vary. Handwriting romantics aren't usually referring to any crude letter form created by pen and ink. They're picturing the fluid, joined-up letters of the Palmer method, which dominated first and second grade pedagogy for much of the 20th century, or perhaps they're longing for a past they never actually experienced, envisioning the sharply angled Spencerian script of the 1800s. Despite the proliferation of handwriting eulogies, it seems that no one is really arguing against the fact that everyone still writes. We just tend to use unjoined print instead of a fluid Palmerian style, and we use it less often. I have mixed feelings about this state of affairs, and it's pained me when I came across a student who was unable to read a script handwriting at all. Side editor's note here. I am one of those people that cannot read cursive whatsoever. I can kind of suss it out, but it's not intuitive. Back to the article. But my own writing morphed from Palmerian script into a mostly print shortly after starting college. Like most gradual changes of habit, I can't exactly recall why this happened, although I remember the change occurred at a time where I regularly had to copy down reams of notes for mathematics and engineering lectures. In her book, Teach Yourself Better Handwriting, the handwriting expert and type designer Rosemary Sassoon notes that most of us need a flexible way of writing, fast, almost a scribble for ourselves to read, and progressively slower and more legible for other purposes. Comparing unjoined print to joined writing, she points out that separate letters can seldom be as fast as joined ones. So if joined handwriting is supposed to be faster, why would I switch away from it at a time when I need to write quickly? Given the amount of time I spend on computers, it would be easy for an opinionated observer to count my handwriting as another victim of computer technology. But I knew script. I used it through high school, and I shifted away from it during a time where I was writing most. My experience with the fountain pen suggests a new answer. Perhaps it's not digital technology that hindered my handwriting, but the technology I was holding as I put pen to paper. Fountain pens want to connect letters. Ballpoint pens need to be convinced to write, need to be pushed into the paper rather than merely touching it. The number 2 pencils I used for math notes weren't much of a break either, requiring pressure similar to that of a ballpoint pen. Moreover, digital technology didn't really take off until the fountain pen had already begun its decline and the ballpoint pen its rise. The ballpoint pen became popular at roughly the same time as mainframe computers. Articles about the decline of handwriting date back to at least the 1960s, long after the typewriter, but a full decade before the rise of the home computer. Sassoon's analysis of how we're taught to hold pens makes a much stronger case for the role of the ballpoint in the decline of cursive. She explains that the type of grip that's been used for generations long before everyone wrote with ballpoints. However, writing with a ballpoint and other modern pens require that they be placed at a greater, more upright angle to the paper, a position that's generally uncomfortable with a traditional pen hold. Even before keyboard computers turned so many people into carpal tunnel sufferers, The ballpoint pen was already straining hands and wrists. Here's Sassoon. We must find ways of holding modern pens that will enable us to write without pain. We also need to encourage efficient letters suited to modern pens. Unless we begin to do something sensible about letters and pen holds, we will contribute more to the demise of handwriting than the coming of the computer has done. I wonder how many other mundane skills shaped to accommodate outmoded objects persist beyond their utility. It's not news to anyone that students used to write with fountain pens, but knowing this isn't the same as the tactile experience of writing with one. Without that experience, it's easy to continue past practices without stopping to notice the action no longer fits the tool. Perhaps saving handwriting, air quotes, is less of a matter of invoking blind nostalgia and more of a process of examining the historical use of ordinary technologies as a way to understand contemporary ones. Otherwise, we may not realize which habits are worth passing on, and which are vestiges of circumstances long since past. This article was brought to you by The Atlantic, written by Josh Geiserbrek. Josh is a writer, artist, programmer, and public school teacher based out of British Columbia, Canada. Check it out at theatlantic.com. Thank you for listening to this little excerpt. I thought it might be fun to take some of these cute little articles and opinion pieces I've seen and put them in audio form. I want to give full total credit to the people that wrote these. Please go check out the articles properly and, follow all the artists, give credit, blah, 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 typical thing. Thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you. If you want to interact with me personally, or you want to interact with the community that I've so laboriously built, please consider joining my Discord at discord.gg/HIMedia. I'd love to see you there. Have a good one, everybody.